Welcome to another explainer. Now, when we think of the Second World War, I bet your mind probably jumps straight to brilliant battlefield tactics, right? Or dramatic speeches or massive troop formations. But today, we are going to look at this conflict through a completely different lens. We're going to see exactly how supply lines changed the entire world. We're talking about an unprecedented evolution in global logistics, going from localized foraging and simple train networks into this massive, multimodal, intercontinental struggle for resources. Because the reality is, the nations that could adapt and actually keep their troops fed, fueled, and armed across thousands of miles, well, they were the ones destined to win. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to use this geographic roadmap to see how logistics dictated the outcome in 5 distinct theaters of war: the Atlantic supply crisis, disrupting desert logistics, freezing on the Eastern Front, Japan's desperate resource grab, and finally, the Allied production juggernaut. Section 1. The Atlantic supply crisis and setting the stakes. Let's start with the absolute lifeblood of the Allied war effort, which was, of course, the Atlantic Ocean. Early in the war, Britain found itself in a deeply precarious position. Their survival depended almost entirely on American food and munitions successfully crossing that U-boat-infested water. Which brings us to a massive, high-stakes problem. How exactly do you save a starving island? See, the United States under President Roosevelt was perfectly willing to send over weapons and food to help Churchill and the British people out. But there was a massive hurdle. German U-boats were sinking thousands of Allied supply ships out in the Atlantic. And yeah, that included American ones. It was a brutal equation, really. If the Germans could manage to sever Britain's supply line, the UK would literally starve and be forced out of the war completely. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it shows that supply lines had to fundamentally change and evolve to survive. The Allies couldn't just build more ships to replace the sunken ones. They had to invent better ways to protect them in this rapid do-or-die tech race. This led to massive leaps forward, improved radar systems to spot surfaced subs, aircraft with much longer ranges to patrol those vast ocean gaps, and heavily coordinated convoy tactics. But you know what the true game changer was? The ultimate logistical victory here was Alan Turing and his team of codebreakers successfully cracking Germany's secret Enigma code. By relying on high-tech intelligence rather than just brute force shipping, the Allies gradually rendered those U-boats less and less of a threat. But man, the sheer desperation of this supply crisis led to some truly wild ideas. Because traditional materials like steel were in such incredibly short supply, the Allies actually considered building an aircraft carrier out of a mixture of wood and ice. They called it pykrete. Get this, at one planning meeting, a guy literally took some regular wood and shot it with a gun, and it shattered. Then he shot a block of pykrete, and the bullet actually ricocheted right off it and hit someone else in the conference room. No way, right? Well, a pykrete aircraft carrier was ultimately scrapped because, well, it was kind of a really dumb idea. It perfectly highlights just how desperate the Allies were to maintain those shipping lanes.
Section 2. Disrupting desert logistics during the African campaign. With the Atlantic gradually being secured, the war for supply lines raged just as fiercely on land over in the blistering heat of North Africa. Here, holding key geographical points wasn't really about territory. It was entirely about controlling the flow of supplies.
And this brings us to a frankly staggering number: 8 months. As the German commander Rommel and his tank divisions pushed British forces back toward Egypt, they honestly seemed unstoppable. But they left a massive thorn in their own side. A small, mostly Australian force held out under siege at the city of Tobruk for 8 agonizing months. So why does this matter? Well, because Tobruk was a strategic port city. By stubbornly denying the Germans access to this port, the defenders completely disrupted and ruined Rommel's supply line. He just couldn't get the fuel and materials he needed to sustain his push, proving that even a really small force can totally halt an army if they cut off its lifeline. Section 3. Freezing on the Eastern Front, or hubris in the cold. Let's move to the next theater and see how this builds, as we shift from the scorching desert to the absolute most brutal logistical failure of the entire war: Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. This slide right here, this is the horrific cost of logistical arrogance. When the infamous Russian winter hit, the invading German military was completely unprepared. It got cold, stupid cold. Hitler had totally ignored the logistics of a winter war, just assuming the Soviets would give up before the snow fell. Spoiler alert, they didn't. As a result, German commanders were reporting that oil was literally freezing inside their vehicles. They had to leave the corpses of their frozen horses by the side of the road just to use them as markers so they could find their way through the snowdrifts. And unimaginably, the soldiers were still stuck in their summer uniforms. Now, compare that to Soviet logistical resilience. Earlier in the invasion, the Soviets had safely moved their entire factories far to the east, totally out of German reach. Stalin then called in specialized Siberian troops who were fully equipped, heavily supplied with winter clothing, and explicitly trained to fight in the extreme cold. The Germans simply weren't a match for an army that was actually equipped for the environment. To put the scale of this failure into perspective, look at this number, 3 million. That is the staggering initial number of troops Hitler sent into the largest ground invasion in human history. To send 3 million men into the brutal Russian winter without proper clothing or winterized equipment isn't just a tactical error, it is a monumental, world-changing collapse of a supply line. It absolutely halted the German war machine in its tracks and bought the Soviets the crucial time they needed to counterattack.
Section 4. Japan's desperate resource grab to expand the sphere. Meanwhile, a completely different yet equally desperate logistical crisis was unfolding on the other side of the world. Japan's entry into the wider world war wasn't just about conquering land for the sake of it. It was fundamentally a desperate bid for what our source material perfectly calls sweet, sweet materials. Their ongoing war in China had essentially ground to a standstill, and they desperately needed raw materials and resources to fuel their military.
Now, because the resources they needed in Southeast Asia were heavily held by America and Great Britain, Japan knew they would have to cross a massive ocean to get them. Knowing their navy couldn't withstand a prolonged war against the US and the UK, they gambled on a preemptive strike. In December 1941, they attacked Pearl Harbor, hoping to just completely destroy the US Pacific Fleet in one single blow. With the fleet temporarily crippled, Japan expanded with terrifying speed. In early 1942, they rapidly conquered Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines. By mid-1942, they were sweeping through Singapore, the East Indies, and were even threatening the borders of India. It was this dizzying, staggering conquest of territory, all specifically designed to secure naval dominance and raw materials. So the crucial point is that it ultimately came down to speed versus sustained power. Japan's initial, staggering victories were based almost entirely on speed. They moved way faster than the Allies could react. But here's the catch. Expanding that quickly means stretching your supply lines thinner and thinner across thousands of miles of open ocean. They were incredibly fast, for sure, but their lack of sustained logistical power, meaning the ability to actually keep those newly conquered islands supplied and defended against a fully mobilized enemy, would eventually, inevitably, catch up with them.
Section 5. The Allied production juggernaut and outproducing the Axis. And this brings us right to the climax of our explainer. Because while the Axis powers were out there overextending their supply lines in Russia and across the Pacific, the Allies were securing theirs. This was the turning point, the moment when secure supplies and unmatched, unstoppable production capabilities turned the tide of the entire globe. This is exactly where supply lines permanently changed the nature of war. It was no longer just about moving food around. It was about the unstoppable rhythm of an unbothered, massive industrial machine. Remember those Soviet factories that were relocated to the east? Well, they were now safely churning out, in the very colorful words of our source, a butt-ton of tanks and aircraft, getting the Soviet army completely up to scratch. Meanwhile, with America in the war, Allied bombers were running devastating raids over German cities, actively destroying Axis infrastructure and production. At the exact same time, factories in the US and the UK were working around the clock, completely safe from ground invasion. All of this material, plus millions of troops, were slowly being gathered in England, stockpiling for an invasion of Europe, the likes of which the world had literally never seen. The Allies were simply outscaling and overwhelming the depleted Axis forces on every single front. And because the Allies knew their supply chain was ultimately superior, their morale held up even in the darkest moments. Late in the war, during the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler launched this desperate last-ditch offensive, using up the absolute remainder of Germany's strength. He actually managed to trap a group of American forces in the Belgian town of Bastogne. Cut off from their massive supply network, the Germans sent the Americans a message basically demanding they surrender or be annihilated. The American commanding officer's official reply? One single word: nuts. I mean, what a response. General Patton's army soon broke the siege, and the German advance collapsed. Even when temporarily cut off, the Allies knew the full weight of their logistical machine was coming to back them up.
From there, it was just a calculated dismantling of the Axis powers, driven entirely by superior supply capabilities. British and American forces first leveraged their supplies to squeeze the Germans and Italians completely out of North Africa, pushing right up into Italy. This momentum led directly to the D-Day logistics masterpiece, where an armada of ships and an absolute mountain of supplies carried Allied troops onto the beaches of Normandy, successfully opening the Western Front. Meanwhile, over in the Pacific, the Americans utilized their repaired and vastly expanded navy for a brutal island-hopping campaign, securing tiny, fiercely defended islands one by one to create a supply chain stepping stone straight toward the Japanese mainland. Finally, the deployment of the atomic bomb, which was the ultimate, devastating product of the Allied technological and industrial machine, forced Japan's surrender and finally ended the 6-year global conflict.
So, what does this all mean for us? We've seen how the freezing of oil, the stubborn defense of a single desert port, and the ability to outproduce your enemy in safe factories literally determine the fate of the entire world. Which leaves us with a fascinating and honestly maybe slightly unsettling thought to end on. If history proves that global conflicts are truly won and lost in the factories, the shipping lanes, and on the supply routes, just how vulnerable are the complex global supply lines that you and I rely on every single day? It's a pretty powerful reminder that logistics didn't just shape our history, they absolutely hold the key to our future. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.